All right. So this is second to last week of Philippians. So we just have today and then one more Wednesday to finish it up. So commend you guys for digging deep and making it through the whole book. That's an accomplishment. I think that you are probably in the top 1% of Christians that have studied an entire book in-depthly and can own the content of that book. So what I want to do this week, we're going to go through verses 1 through 9 of chapter 4, and then we'll finish up the rest next week. But next week, I also want to go back and do a summary overview of the whole book, so you get a feel, so you can have some thoughts and some ideas that encapsulate the big ideas of the whole book. That make sense? And so when somebody asks you, what's Philippians about? You'll have, it's not just about joy. Joy is one of the things, but there's a lot more to it, as we'll see as we get into today's book. All right. Let me actually add this. I'm going to jump right to the text. You guys don't need any help with the method, right? The inductive method. I think everybody here is a veteran. So you had some extra credit points that you could have earned for your team by sending in implication questions. So Mark's team had the most questions by far. Peter's team had the most implication questions. So you guys had a lot of questions, but a lot of them were factual questions. Like, what's the cause? What's the effect? That's a factual question. You'd have to answer all those questions in order to ask an implication question. That make sense? Most of the implication questions that were asked were not based on answers. So you didn't go through the work of asking of answering your factual questions first so that you could come up with a good implication question. So, for example, right, let me go to this one. So this is our text. What does chapter 4, verse 1 start with? Therefore. And so what do we know that is? It's a causation. Where's the cause? The previous material, so the previous paragraph. The effect would be verse 1. That makes sense? So let's take a look at this really quick. So if we go back here, what's the cause? Well, let's go here. So, what's the effect? Stand fast in the Lord. That's the effect. What should cause us to stand fast in the Lord? So we go back. Now, so remember this. I think I can do this here. So remember that verse 18 here, right? What is that? Substantiation, right? So that whole sentence is a substantiation. Verse 20, what's that? It's another substantiation that our citizenship is in heaven. Is supporting the main idea, right? That's what a substantiation is. This is an idea, a truth, a principle that's supporting the main assertion that's being made. So neither of those things can be the cause, because they're supporting the cause. What's the cause here? Excellent. Paul says, join in following my example. So the cause is following Paul's example. That should have what effect on our lives? It should cause us to stand fast in the Lord. Okay, that makes sense? All right. Now, just because we'll break this down in a second, what implication question could you ask about that causation now? Because this is what no one got. What's the actual implication question? That's a factual question. That's a factual question. That's asking a definition. Remember, implication questions are, what does this imply? What's the significance of this? So here's an implication question for this. First implication question I would ask is, what does this imply we need in order to stand fast? That make sense? That if having Paul as an example is what causes me to stand fast, what does that imply I need if I'm going to stand fast? I need an example to follow. If I don't follow a godly example, if I don't have a mentor or a godly example that I'm patterning my life after, what does that mean? I'm not going to stand fast. That makes sense? All right, and then we could go into the more implications. What does this imply about not having a role model? It's hard to achieve that without a role model. You can't stand fast alone. So if I'm not, let me ask it this way. What does this imply if I'm not following a godly example intentionally? What does that imply that I am following? A worldly example. So I'm following an example one way or the other.
In the passage right before he says, follow my example, he talks about as many as are mature. Is there also potentially an implication that we need to be that example as well? Or is that not there?
We can probably, it's hard to probably pull out of this one. It'll come in later in the text, for sure. But probably hard to pull out of that it's mature thinking to have a role model. I think that we could pull out. And so then you could ask the implication question, what does this imply about us if we don't have? Right? If the mature are the ones that have godly role models, what does it imply about us if we don't have a godly role model that we're patterning our life out of? We're immature. It's immature to think I don't need a role model. It's immature to think I can do this on my own. That make sense?
So when I'm sorry, this is what I was thinking, okay?
Okay, go.
I was thinking of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were taken out of their place, but they still stood fast.
Okay, but what book is that example in? What book is it in? Daniel. Does Paul quote Daniel? So this is all out of bounds and can't relate. You cannot make that assertion because the text doesn't. So you're doing something that Paul's not even willing to do. That makes sense? If it was important, if that was an important illustration of the point, Paul would have made it. And this is where we have to be disciplined in our Bible study to stick with what the text says. That makes sense? And we're always confident that our applications are going to be solid because we haven't deviated from what the author who was inspired by the Holy Spirit thought was important. Okay? All right, so let's break down this causation a little bit. Actually, let me go back one. Any questions about there's not a whole lot going on here structurally, right? What do we have a lot of? Well, so we've got a lot of in the Lord, in the Lord, in the Lord. The Lord's at hand through Christ, right? So we've got a lot of this idea of in the Lord. So this idea of standing fast in the Lord, particularly in the Lord, is what's key here for Paul, because he's going to keep repeating this idea of in the Lord. And so these other statements that he's going to make have a link back to the stand fast in the Lord, because he's going to keep referencing what it means to be in the Lord. What kind of statements are they? It's harder to pick up in the English than it is in the Greek, because Greek is very clear what the verb tense is, and if you were educated in the public school system like I was, your grammar's not super great in English. But what are these verbs? They're imperatives. What do imperatives mean? They're commands, right? So stand fast is an imperative. Be of the same mind is an imperative. Help these women is an imperative. Rejoice is an imperative. Let your gentleness be known is an imperative. Be anxious for nothing is an imperative. Meditate is an imperative. So it's just a big, long list of things that Paul's commanding the Philippians to do. The common denominator in the text is it's a lot of things that are being commanded. It's not a lot of principles being taught. That makes sense? So Paul's kind of done teaching principles. He'll have some in here, but he's done with the theology, and what's he moving on to? Practical application. This is Paul's like, here's your application dump. All right, here's all the things. Because of everything I've been teaching, here's now what you should do. This makes sense? Okay. So now let's go to this first causation, which is really the only big structure that we have in this segment. In these 11 verses, or 9 verses, we've got a big contrast coming up. So what's the causation? What's the cause? What did we say it was? Yeah, follow Paul's example as well as others who live a similar way. So, just really quickly, what's significant about that? About the fact that Paul says, follow my example as well as those who live in a similar manner. He's making a distinction. It's more than just him, right? You should be in a community that lives this way. That makes sense? Not just have one person. Try to get plugged into a community that lives a specific way. And what is that specific way? Well, and then he gave us 2 substantiations, right, of why we needed to follow his example. Because if you don't follow Paul's example, what are you? You're an enemy of the cross. It's a pretty big deal. If you do follow Paul's example, what are you? You're a citizen of heaven. You belong to heaven. So it's a pretty big distinction that Paul's making here. That makes sense? All right, that follow this example and be in a community that lives this way, because the stakes are really high. If you get sucked into worldly thinking, you're going to be an enemy of the cross. If you get plugged into this kind of community that has this right influence, then you're going to have that strong sense of belonging to heaven. Okay? Now, what is that? What's the effect? What did we say the effect was? Stand fast in the Lord. Okay? And he says, my beloved, long for my joy, my crown. What does it mean to stand fast? This would be the first question you'd want to ask. What kind of a question is that? All right, so this is factual. not implication. Okay? What is the causation? What kind of a question is that? What's the cause and effect? What kind of a question is that? That is factual. Okay, there's no implications here. It's a cut and dry, clean answer. There's almost no thinking that has to be done with factual questions. You just have to read the answer. Okay? So the word stand fast, if you looked it up, was steko, and it means to continue in a state, to continue to be. What's significant about that?
It's ongoing. It never stops.
Okay. Yeah, you can do it. Remember, where are we supposed to stand fast? In the Lord. So what's Paul saying here? You should be following my example and be plugged into a community of people who follow my example, who are all living the same way, so that you can stand fast or continue to be in what state? In the Lord. What's significant about that? What does that say about the state of our lives?
If you're with a community, you're already in the Lord.
Not necessarily. I like where you're going with it, but think about it.
It's an effect of being in the Lord. It shows that you're in the Lord, being in community.
Okay, being in community helps cause you to be in the Lord, but I'm just thinking about the significance of the state of life that we're supposed to have. What are we supposed to be? What? We'll get to that. So I just want you to think about this. What Paul's saying here is that the character of our lives should be such that we are living in the Lord. This is the state that I'm to continually be in. I'm to be in a continual state of in the Lord. This is the environment. The Lord is like, if I'm a fish, the Lord is the water that I'm suspended in. The Lord is my environment. And when you understand Paul's thinking like this, it'll make sense when he says things like, in him we live and move and have our being. This is this concept that I'm to be continually in the Lord. I'm not to be in the world. I'm not to be in my own head. I'm not to be in my own ambition. I'm not to be in my own problems. I'm not to be in any of these things. What am I supposed to be in? The Lord. Now, what does that mean? So, remember, we have a cause that's producing this effect. What's our cause? Paul's example. What do we know from last week about Paul's example?
He gave up everything to be in the Lord.
Yeah, so what did he not have? Do you remember? No self-confidence. Right? So if I'm in the Lord, what does that look like? All my confidence is in the Lord. I'm not looking to have self-confidence. I'm not looking to build myself up. I'm not looking to feel better about myself because I'm not living in myself. That's not the state I'm trying to be in. And this is, if we can get this paradigm shift, this is where life starts to be radically God-focused and radically better. Because most people are trying to improve the state of their own being instead of being more consistently in the Lord. That makes sense? They want to feel better about themselves. They want to be more, perceive themselves as more important. It's all about ourselves, and we waste so much time trying to improve the state of being in our own lives. It makes sense? Our own well-being is not supposed to be what concerns us. What's supposed to concern us? Being in the Lord. The Lord's stuff is supposed to concern us. And when you can get that, all the self-focus and all the drama and all the disagreement and all the confusion and all the anxiety and all these things that Paul's going to talk about disappear. Because they don't belong in the Lord. None of those things are a part of being in the Lord. That makes sense? Yeah? Yes, yes, yes. Okay. All right. Bless you.
It's interesting because you think about standing fast, it's kind of like almost a passive thing, but it's an active process. It's talking about actively standing fast.
Mm-hmm.
Stationary, but you're active stationary.
Yeah, I don't know if you've ever, anybody ever swim in a rip current? All right, so if I say, hey, I want you to stay where you are, stand fast in your position in the ocean right now, what would that require? A lot of work, right? So standing in one place doesn't mean you turn off and you just chill and veg. It takes a ton of effort to stand fast, right? Now, what else does Paul tell us about himself? What else did he say about his example? If you go back a paragraph, he had put no confidence in the flesh. Then what else?
He lost everything.
Yeah, so first he counts whatever was gained to him loss. Right? So he writes it off the books. If you've ever had a business, right, you have write-offs, things that you're writing off as a loss. That's what Paul's doing with everything that was gained to him. He's saying, I'm just going to write this off. I'm going to charge it off. It's coming off the books as being in my favor. It makes sense? That's what it means to count it a loss. Things I used to consider a benefit to me personally, I'm now taking those off my ledger, and they're no longer adding value to my life. Okay, so that's Paul's example. He looks at the things that have to do with himself, and he's saying none of these self-focused things are going to add value to my life anymore. Make sense? Okay. Then, what's the next thing he does?
Righteousness from the law.
Before that, we'll get there, so hold that thought. There's one more, right? So he counts it loss, and then we're gonna take rubbish and put it with loss, right? That is just worthless. It's just trash. We're gonna put that in the same category. But he counts it, and then he suffers it loss. Remember that? So Paul didn't just theoretically write it off. He actually lost in his life. He lost his reputation. He lost his position. He lost his finances. He lost his property. He ends up in Rome penniless. He actually loses it all. He doesn't just theoretically say, yes, I count it loss. He actually lives a life that results in losing everything. He actually suffers the loss. And why does he do all of this? So that he can gain Christ. Okay, and then now here comes the key part, right? It was going to attach it back to being in the Lord. As Paul does all of this, jettisons all of this stuff so that he can gain Christ, where does Paul want to be found? In him. And what's the main characteristic of being in him? Not having a righteousness of my own, which comes through what? The law, which is a metaphor for self-effort. So Paul's saying, I want to be found in Jesus, not having any rightness before God based on my own effort. And so that's why he had to jettison everything that he gained by self-effort. Because if I keep that, the things that I view as products of my own hard work and initiative that make me right before God or better, in a better position with God, then I'm being found in Christ with what? My own righteousness. So if I want to be found in Christ without my own righteousness, what do I have to do? I've got to give it up. I've got to consider it garbage, because if I am found in Christ in my own works, what's that going to result in? And what happens if you get found in your own self-righteousness? What happens on Judgment Day if you're found in your own righteousness? Yeah, you're judged and damned to hell for eternity. Right? And so you see how Paul's like, this is such a deception, this idea that I need to do stuff to improve my self-worth before God. That actually locks me into judgment. That kind of thinking is garbage thinking. I need to get rid of all my own effort thinking that I'm doing anything that makes me better or puts me in a better position. I want to be found completely in Jesus without any of my own righteousness, but having the righteousness which comes through faith, right? Through believing that Jesus is the one that produces all that righteousness. And so then what does Paul do? What does he make it his life ambition? To know Jesus and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his suffering. Why does Paul want to know Jesus and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his suffering so bad? Yeah, how do you get Jesus' righteousness? You've got to die to yourself and be raised to a new life in Christ. You have to be positioned by the resurrection in Jesus. It's the only way to be found in Jesus, is to be positioned by Jesus' resurrection in Christ. It makes sense? If you have not died with Christ on the cross and been raised with him, you are not in him. And so Paul says, I want to know his suffering. Because what does that prove? That I've embraced the crucifixion. I've embraced death to self. If I don't want suffering, what does that prove? I'm still living for me. I'm unwilling to have me suffer because it's all about me. This make sense? Yeah? Okay. Because we still haven't gotten to verse 1 yet. Now, as Paul, the last thing Paul had about his example was what? You had brought this up.
Yes, he wasn't perfect, and he pressed on, which know God, to get this
Yeah, so Paul had a goal, right? And the goal was what? To know Christ, to be found in him, in his righteousness, and attain to the permanent resurrection of the dead, right? Where it's just sealed and locked for eternity. That's Paul's goal. How does he see himself on this journey? It's not perfect, but what is he? He's mature, so he's farther along the process than most, but he's not perfect yet. He hasn't attained that yet. In his state of maturity, what's that motivating him to do? Is he like, whew, I made it to maturity. I can kick back. It's retirement, spiritually time. Where's my leisure world? Let's get a spiritual RV and travel the country and golf every day. As Paul's nearing the end of this race to be found in Christ, is he letting off on the gas? He's like, yeah, forget all that. I'm going to treat today if this was as if the first day I got saved. And he presses. The closer Paul gets, the harder he presses. The more effort he puts into growing and maturing. And so what's the implication for us? Yeah, so ask yourself first, where are you on the continuum?
I'm on it.
Are you, you're on it. Are you on the early stages? Would you consider yourself mature like Paul, where you've counted it all loss? You've suffered it loss? Your main ambition in life is to know Jesus' sufferings and the power of his resurrection, transforming your life from self-focused to Father-focused? Maturing? Which is good. You're making progress, right? But think about this. So as Paul matures, he realizes, I need to press harder to reach this goal. If we were immature, what should that press upon us?
Oh man, we made it this far. It's pretty good. You have a little self-confidence now. You made it already. Sure.
But if we could take a mature mind and dump it into an immature person, what should happen in that person's mind? Panic, right? Like I remember my very first marathon. This was before they had the chips. Anybody run? Anybody runner? No runners? Anybody ever run a marathon? Halves? Same thing. So nowadays in your bib there's a little chip. You know that?
Yeah, or in your ankle.
Or in your ankle, yeah, depending on how you get it. And so they don't start your time until you cross the starting line. Once you pass that, it starts your official race time. Back in the day, when I was a lot younger, my very first marathon I ran, I'm so far back in the pack by the time, and I had this dream of qualifying for the Boston Marathon, and you got to run a 3:30 in order to qualify. And so it was one of my big goals was to run a 3 hour and 30-minute marathon. And so I had it all planned out, right? It's like 6 minute 40-second miles for your marathon, and you can qualify. By the time I get to the starting line, because the gun goes off and you stand there. Because, you've got 1,000 people in front of you, and it's like traffic starting from a traffic light. By the time I cross the starting line, there's 7 minutes have ticked off. And what did that do to me? I just panicked. My first mile was a 4:57. God, just so much adrenaline, and I just sprinted out ahead. This is what studying this book should do to us. We realize, wow, if Paul, at the end of his life, realizes he needs to press harder, what should that do for us that are 25 miles behind him?
No, he wants us to rejoice. He wants us to panic.
Well, in the right kind of way, right? He wants us to be motivated. Not panic probably isn't the right word, but he wants a sense of motivation in our hearts. An urgency, yes, that's probably a better word. Thank you. Right? The sense of urgency to press towards this goal. Now, this is the cause. What's the effect? Stand fast in the Lord, right? And remember, stand fast is to continue in a state. Now, if we go back for a second, I want you to see all the connections here, right? Of in the Lord, in the Lord, in the Lord, the Lord, through Christ. What we're going to see is that Paul is going to give us a series of commands about what it means to stand fast in the Lord. He's going to start to now expand on and expound upon what it means to be in the Lord. So, what's the first thing here that Paul says we need to do to stand fast in the Lord? What does he address? So what's the first imperative? Verses 2 and 3. Who does he ask to be of the same mind? Euodia and Syntyche. He says, I want you to be of the same mind. What's the implication here? This should have been one of the easy implication questions. That they haven't been, right? So what's implied here is that these two women are not of the same mind. What does that mean? What do we call that?
Enemies of God.
No, because these are fellow laborers of Paul, right? These are not enemies of the cross. These are Paul's fellow laborers. But what are they? What are they in? They're in disagreement. Right? They're in disagreement. They're not thinking the same, and they're holding to their own way of thinking. And it's causing conflict that is so severe it's gotten back to Paul. Think about that. How bad does conflict have to get for the news to reach Paul in prison and him to write about it? And he's calling him out to the whole church. All right. So as we think about, Paul's saying, I want you to stand fast. And now he's giving very clear direction to specific individuals in the church about how to stand fast. Implication here is, if you don't do this, you are not standing fast in the Lord. All right, so what's the first imperative? How would you summarize that? Yeah, be in unity. I like the idea, since the word here means to be in agreement. I like the idea of be agreeable. That someone who's standing fast in the Lord is agreeable. What does that imply about people who are not standing fast in the Lord? What are they? Disagreeable. I want you to understand this, because some people see it mistakenly as a virtue to constantly disagree. Paul says that is not standing fast in the Lord. Being someone who stirs up controversy and disagreement.
But be agreeable with his fellow believers.
Yes, this is in the Lord.
So it's not just being agreeable for the sake of getting along with anybody. It's, you want to get along, as Paul says elsewhere, but it's not.
It's in what?
In the Lord.
In the Lord. right? And so what's the here's what this is a fun passage to really work on our implication questions, because there's so much implied by what Paul's doing. What's implied about this? Think about what he's just said about following his example should cause us to stand fast. If these two women were standing fast, they would be agreeable, of the same mind in the Lord. What do we just hear from Paul about his example? What did his life look like in the Lord?
Disagreeableness is a self-centered or self-serving characteristic.
Yeah, what's implied about what's causing the disagreement? Self-interest is what's causing them to be in disagreement. All right? There's something they're unwilling to count loss personally. They're unwilling to lose on an issue that's important to them because it's not about Jesus, it's about them. That makes sense? One of the activities I do when I do premarital counseling is I'll bring some cash with me, and I'll put on the table a $100 bill, a $50 bill, a $20, a $10, a $5, and a $1. And I'll ask them to write out 6 of their top values for marriage. And so if you were to think about that, if you were married, going to get married, what would be your top 6 values? All right? And then I have them rank them 1 to 6. So for Nan and I, our number 1 value is tenderness between us. We've just found over the years that if we lose tenderness, it affects every other value we have. All right? And so for us, nothing is worth more than tenderness. If I say, okay, let's take tenderness, for example. If I want to hold on to, and I say, which bill do you want? And everyone always takes the 100, right? Because it's the most valuable. And I said, okay, now, you can only have one at a time. And so we're going to call being right a $1 bill. In order for you to be right, what do you have to give up? $100. You have to give up tenderness. You can be right. I'll gladly swap you. You can have, and I think the devil does that. He's like, oh, you were wronged by the, you go ahead and hold on to that grudge, right? That's your $2 bill. But you've got to surrender the 100 to get that. That makes sense? And so it's that same idea that Paul has here, that if we aren't willing to count personal gain loss, we end up holding on to something that causes us to lose Christ. Which one's more valuable? Christ. And so Paul's begging these two women to count whatever you need to count a loss so that you can be agreeable. Because what you're going to lose in holding on to your disagreement isn't nearly worth it. That makes sense? You're going to lose your standing, your firmness in Christ to be in conflict with another brother or sister over an issue that has nothing to do with Christ. That makes sense? All right, so hopefully this helps, right? This is, so now let's go to application. We haven't done a whole lot of application. We've gone our factual. We've looked at our implication. What would be an application coming out of this? Yeah, am I in disagreement? Am I in conflict with anyone in the church? Am I in conflict with a brother and sister on social media? Am I in conflict with a brother or sister in my family? What's implied about what causes that? Selfishness. And so what's the solution to interpersonal conflict.
That's back in Jesus chapter 2, where he gave up his growth and self-interest, he gave up his rights.
Yeah. So this is you can always have reconciliation if you are willing to count something loss. You can have reconciliation immediately if you are willing to count something loss. If neither person's willing to count something loss, it's impossible to reconcile. That make sense? And so if you are in conflict, what's your application? Yeah, make a choice about what you're going to give up to reconcile with that person. That make sense? Okay. Now, is this easy? How do we know? He's imploring them, and in verse 3, what does he do? They need help. He enlists help. Right? He gets some key male leaders in the church to come alongside these two women and help them work it out. This is probably what we're probably seeing here is Paul calling upon elders to step up and do their job. That makes sense? This would be the function of an elder to help bring reconciliation among two people that are causing significant turmoil in the church. That make sense? Any questions about the first one?
Can we tell how these elders may have helped a specific situation?
We can't. He just says, help them. Right? He says, I'm asking you to come alongside them and help them. I would say the one thing that could potentially be implied is that what does Paul reference about these two ladies? So what's this? What does that imply about what might help them?
Realize they have the same goal, and that they're fellow workers for the Lord.
Yeah, point them to something bigger than themselves. All right? Hey, let's take our focus off ourselves. Let's get back to the gospel. All right? And what do we have to surrender, give up so that we can put all this energy? And this is the thing that always just bums me out about conflict is it burns so much energy and time. It is the biggest waste of mental, spiritual, emotional energy because it accomplishes absolutely nothing, but it hinders absolutely everything. And Paul gets that, and so he's like, hey, those of you that are mature, come alongside these women, help them stand fast in the Lord. Let's put our focus back where it needs to be on laboring for the gospel, not for our own silos, agendas, pet projects, whatever it is that's causing this conflict. Any other questions, thoughts about that? All right, what's the next one? Yeah, so the next one is be joyful. Right? So be agreeable and then be joyful. We spent a lot of time on what it meant to be joyful, so we won't beat that one again. But so let's jump right into implication. What's significant about the fact that Paul commands the Philippians to be joyful? It's a choice, right? If it's a command, we normally think of joy as a byproduct of something that happens to us or happens for us, right? We think of the joy, rejoicing, as being the effect rather than the cause. I want you to flip that in your thinking because Paul's putting it here as a cause to help you stand fast. That make sense? And so if I can be commanded to rejoice, what does that say about my attitude? It's a choice, right?
Well, what about in Galatians where it talks about the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy. So part of joyfulness, being joyful, is a fruit of the Spirit. And it's not necessarily
Joy is definitely a fruit of the Spirit. Yeah, he's not referencing it, but it's an interesting question. It's not what he's addressing here in this passage.
what you just said.
All right, but if we were to go to Galatians, Paul spends a lot of time in Galatians about walking in the Spirit. And then joy is a byproduct of walking in the Spirit. That makes sense? But here he's clearly saying, rejoice. You have a choice to be joyful or not. That make sense?
Not if it's a fruit of the Spirit, then it's given to us by God. Lord, we can rejoice.
Yes. Yeah, I don't want to conflate the fruit of the Spirit with this command right now because it's not addressed by Paul in this passage, and so it gets kind of murky if we try to blend Galatians and Philippians without finishing both thoughts. But what's significant is it's in the Lord. Where do we choose to be joyful?
In the Lord.
In the Lord. What's significant about that?
We have options.
We have options. What does that say about the attitude of someone who's in the Lord? It should be joyful, right? If I'm in the Lord, my predominant attitude in life should be what? Joy. And so joyfulness, the choice to be joyful, is often an indicator of where I'm focusing my attention on in life. Am I focused on being in the Lord? If I am, I'll choose joy. That makes sense? So if I'm not a joyful person, what does that say about me? I'm not standing firm in the Lord.
And what about those situations when you are suffering a lot, like a loss, and you cannot receive yourself?
What has Paul told us about suffering loss here?
It's all joy.
It's all joy. Because what does he understand?
Well, I think that there's also, I mean, it's one thing, it's not, you can just be mourning, I mean, look across the room here, and you can be mourning the loss and still have joy.
Okay, so let's I feel like we've gone too far past joy to remember what it is. Because the comments I'm getting, it sounds like when we're thinking joy right now, it's about feeling good.
Yeah.
And do you remember what joy? All right, Cairo from charis, joy, which is grace. All right, and what is joy? Joy is the experience of God's grace. So whatever circumstances I'm in, what choice do I have? Yeah, I can choose in this to experience God's grace or not. So if I'm going through suffering, what does God's grace look like in suffering? What does God do in His grace when we're suffering? He comforts us. Right? That's an aspect of God's grace that I only get to experience when I'm mourning. If I don't mourn, I never get to experience that side of God's grace. That makes sense? All right? I'm going to break my own rules here. I know, but I'm going to go to a different passage because it's the most succinct and staccato repetition of this idea of joy and rejoicing. You guys familiar with the Sermon on the Mount? Matthew chapter 5, the Beatitudes. What does it say? Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, right? And so there's, blessed are the peacemakers. They'll be sons of God. Blessed are you when you're persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of God, right? So there's all these ideas that sound like, well, how could you be blessed when your circumstances are bad? The word blessed in the Greek has the same root here. And the best rendition in the English is, let the poor in spirit take joy, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Let those who mourn take joy, for they shall be comforted. The Beatitudes are all about practically how you rejoice, how you take joy, you choose joy in a difficult circumstance. By instead of looking to the circumstance or somebody else, you look to God to experience Him in the midst of that circumstance. Remember, what's Paul's big ambition in life? To know Jesus. And Paul says, every new experience I have is an opportunity to experience Jesus in a new way. Every challenge I have is a new opportunity to experience Jesus' faithfulness. Every need I have is an opportunity to experience Jesus' provision. Every struggle I have is an opportunity to experience Jesus' help. Every confusion or sense of being lost that I have is an opportunity to experience Jesus' guidance and wisdom. Does this make sense? Every situation in life is an opportunity to experience more of God. That's what it means to rejoice. It's basically choose God and the joy that comes with experiencing Him. It make sense?
Can you also say it's a blessing because of that?
The people who do that are what we would consider blessed. That make sense? Yeah? Okay. All right. So be joyful in the Lord, right? So it's always in the Lord. Because what am I trying to be? In the Lord. I'm trying to stand fast in the Lord. So in every circumstance, no matter whether it's difficult, great, struggle, easy, I want to choose to find joy in the Lord. Now, what's the next one? Oh, and how often am I supposed to do this? Always. So how often am I allowed to not be joyful? Never. Because what is there always the opportunity to do? To experience God. There is something good to be experienced about God in every circumstance. That make sense? Right? Just went through this with Ellie. She had applied to go do a semester abroad at Cambridge, and they had 100 and something kids apply. They took 15. She didn't get chosen. So she called me all bummed out, and what did I work her through? Where do we find God's goodness in this disappointment? right? And she was like, well, I guess it's going to help strengthen my faith that even though I don't see it, God's got something good for me. And and she was able to press through to look past her own disappointment and try to find God in the midst of it. That make sense? That's what it means to rejoice. All right, what's the next thing? Yeah, before verse 5, right? So before we get to 6, what's verse 5 say? So be gentle. Be gentle. Now, what does it mean to be gentle? Anybody look this up?
Equitable, fair.
Good, right? Yeah. So it's actually it's an interesting word. It actually means to be fair or equitable. And so it's interesting that they chose to translate it gentleness. The idea here is kind of like, don't be a bully. Right? Because bullies use their power to take. Bullies are never about being fair. They're about cheating, hurting, doing whatever to get what they want. Okay? And so what's the idea here? What's the significance of this? Be nice, yep. Yeah, so what does equitable mean? Anybody know what the word, like if you've got to own a home, you probably have equity. What does equitable mean? Yeah, it's shared value, right? So if we go in on a business together, what would be equitable if we put in the same amount of money invested into a business, did the same amount of work, what would be an equitable split? 80-20? 50-50, right? It would be, that makes sense. It's a fair sharing of the value. What does it mean to be equitable in the Lord? Okay.
Give an opportunity for everyone to experience the Lord equally from you.
Yeah, so for there to be equity, what do you have to start with?
2 things at least.
Something of value, right? You have to start with value. For there to be equity, you have to have something of value. For it to be equitable, what do I have to do? I have to share that value. So what does it mean to be equitable in the Lord? Yeah, people should be experiencing the value of me being in the Lord. That make sense? It's not that and this is another area where modern Christianity has gotten off track, where we think the Christian experience is primarily about my experience. It's about me accumulating as much value to myself as I possibly can. I want to have the best experience that I can have in church. I want to grow as much as I can grow. I want the best opportunities that I can possibly have. I want to have the best friendships that I can have. I want to have the best worship experience that I can have. Where's the equity there? Nothing. I'm a greedy Christian. I've taken my worldly materialism and I've swapped it for religious experience. I'm the same greedy person. There's no equity from my life. And so if I'm standing fast in the Lord, where's my focus? How can I share this with as many people as possible? Right? On Sundays, we've been beating this drum for, 3 months now, right? That the gospel is the best news ever, and we should have this sense of equity where it's not just about what do I get out of church, it's how do I share all of God's goodness with as many people as possible, because I derive so much value from being in Christ that I want to share that out with as many people as I possibly can. It would be inequitable for me to keep it all to myself. If I'm standing fast in the Lord, that's how I would see it. For me to keep all this for myself, to make decisions that primarily benefit myself, that are for my best interests, I'm actually losing ground in the Lord. That make sense? And so in order to stand fast in the Lord, I want to be as equitable as possible. Now, what's the thought that Paul throws in here? And what's significant about that? So think about what does that mean, the Lord's at hand? He's close, right? So it's like if I gave, Beto, say I gave Beto $10,000 to go downtown and find some newly, some families with young kids that had just become homeless, and let's set up 3 families in a safe living situation this month. And I gave Beto $10,000 from the church and said, hey, you've got 3 days to go find these families and get things set up. And so Beto goes downtown and Peter joins him, and they hang out the first day at a cafe, kind of people watching. They're having a great time, shooting the breeze. Didn't really see anybody. They come back the next day. Hey, there's a Brazilian steakhouse. Let's go get some lunch. And they go and have a great lunch, really enjoy the fellowship. They pray for the homeless. Day 3 comes along. They go out for a nice breakfast downtown at a nice restaurant. Right? They're just loving it. They're talking about a food truck that's supposed to be really hip that they're going to hit up at lunch. And then I text Beto and say, hey, Beto, I want to meet the families. I'm going to be downtown in an hour. Beto says to Peter, George is at hand. What do we need to do? We haven't been equitable with all the money that George gave us. That make sense? And so Paul's saying, hey, the Lord's at hand. You don't have a lot of time to sit there and hoard all of God's goodness. Right? Get serious about it. The Lord's at hand. Start being equitable with your life. Stop thinking from your own immature, self-focused perspective about what's best for you. What if you could make the paradigm shift that every major decision in your life became about what's better for somebody else? I guarantee that's how Paul thought. Paul did not make major decisions in his life about what was best or safest or most profitable for him. In fact, I would say he went the exact extreme opposite. Everyone is telling him, all his friends are telling him, don't go to Jerusalem, you're going to end up in prison in chains. And what does Paul say? Remember that from the book of Acts? You're breaking my heart. It's what I live for. It's telling me to watch out for myself is actually breaking my heart. Why would that break Paul's heart? He's like, don't you guys know me? Have I been that unclear that you actually think I would succumb to that kind of pressure? Right? Reminds me of Nehemiah when they said, hey, they're going to come kill you. Let's go hide in the temple. What does Nehemiah say? Should such a man as I flee and save himself? That's almost like insulting. Right? And so, we go back to what does it mean to follow Paul's example, and do we have that as a role model? And I think when it comes to major life decisions, this is where it starts to get super clear. Am I making decisions about what's best for me and my family? Or am I making decisions about what's best for those that are in the Lord? It's tough, huh?
But Paul said it's good for you not to be married.
No, I would say it's the opposite. If you can find someone that is your accountability, right, that's your partner in suffering and self-denial and maximizing kingdom impact, that's glorious. When you've got someone, because Ecclesiastes, 2 are better than 1, right? Because when one falls, he's on his own, right? But 2, you get a good reward for your labor. And so I would say, and this is but I would say, this is one thing when people when Christians ask me for advice about who to marry, about who they should marry, I say, pick someone that is more sold out for Jesus than you are, and that will pull you towards Christ. Right? That don't pick somebody that's going to be a drag on your spiritual life your whole life. Now, if you're in a situation where that's your reality, the Bible has some answers. But if you're in that choosing side of things, choose someone. Like I knew I wanted to do missions, so I picked somebody who was on the mission field already. Someone who Nan had already been a year in Kenya. Wasn't any question about whether she was willing to go do missions, live a life of selfless sacrifice. She wasn't into 9-to-5 corporate America, any of that. That makes sense? And so it's the same with where you plug in as a Christian. Are you choosing a community where people are zealous for bringing others into the Lord? Do you have people that you're modeling your life after that are sold out for Jesus? Well, it's one of those kind of woe to you if you're the most radical person you know. Right? You need a better crowd of people, a little more serious about Jesus. Okay? And then the last one here in verses 6 through 7 is be peaceful, right? Be anxious for nothing, right? Literally, be anxious for nothing. And how do we do that? We let our requests be made known. So what's the implication there? What makes us anxious or stressed? Yep, self-reliance. Trying to do it ourselves. I would say that anxiousness is a lack of trust in God. And that peace is a byproduct of entrusting everything in your life to Jesus. All right, and this is what he says, let all your requests be made known through prayer, supplication, with thanksgiving. And so this is one of those practices that I've had, spiritual practice I've had in my life since I was young in college. Learned this from an early mentor, was to take time at least once a week to sit quietly where there are no distractions and just let my mind think. And what happens is when you don't proactively focus on something, your brain has a list of unresolved issues that it keeps for you. And when anybody ever try to sit and just be quiet, what does your brain do? It's like, oh, hey, we're not doing anything. I've got something, right? And it pulls out the list of honeydews for you that, hey, let's worry about this. And hey, since we're not doing anything, we've got time to worry about this. And it just starts going down the list. And my mentor taught me to grab those thoughts and take them captive to Christ. To say, okay, Lord, I'm thinking about this when I don't want to be. So I want to just entrust you with this right now. And I release it to you, and I receive your peace instead. Now let the thought go. And then what happens? Something else comes to mind. I grab that, that thought captive, take it to Christ, and trust him with it, ask for his peace instead, and let it go. First time I did this, it took me over 2 hours. Stuff just kept coming. I had a big, long list of unresolved issues in my life. I had a lot going on at the time. Eventually, and sometimes it comes back up, right? Some things have been on your list so long. I don't know if you've ever done that, where you've got a to-do list and you've actually written it on there multiple weeks in a row. Sometimes you got to give that to the Lord multiple times for it to be truly gone from your worry in your heart, to be fully entrusted to him. And this is your relationships, your finances, your kids, your future spouse, all these things, your job, all these things that can be areas of worry and anxiousness. Just give them to the Lord and ask for his peace instead. After about 2 hours, I came to a place where no more thoughts came. It was the first time, I think, in my life that I had ever been still and experienced the presence of God like I did in that moment. Or like Psalm 46:10 says, be still and know that I'm God. David said, I've stilled and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother. This is something that Paul is giving us very practical application for how to be at peace. You sit and you take all of your requests and you present them to God with thanksgiving. God, thank you that I can trust you with this. Let it go, receive his peace, and you will come to a place, and you may never have been there. This may be a glorious thing for you to try this week, where every single area, conceivable area of your life is entrusted to the Lord. What would that be like? Peaceful. Stress, anxiety is a lack of trust. It's a lack of active, intentional trust. If you will just take the time, and so I do this every week, so it only takes me about 5 minutes now to get to that place of perfect peace. It's glorious. It's just easy to find. It's easy to get there. It's easy to achieve it. Even when I'm in the midst of a bunch of people who are stressed out and anxious, it's very easy for me to stay calm because there's not a lot in my life that isn't entrusted to the Lord. There are a lot of things that are not resolved in my life, but I try to have them all entrusted to the Lord. That make sense? There are a lot of things I don't know how these particular things are going to work out. There are things that still, if I think about it on my own, they create anxiety. But if I learn in those moments to stop, take that captive, and give it to the Lord, then the peace of God that passes all understanding, and that's key, right? Because you don't have to understand to be at peace. This is a peace that goes beyond any logical explanation. You don't have to see the way out. You don't have to have an answer for how that resolves. This goes past all that. It supersedes it. And then it guards you. It actually protects you from future anxiety. That make sense? So one last thought, because we're already out of time. That went by fast tonight. A lot of people think they get peace from making the right decision. I want to let you know that's unbiblical. You don't get peace from making good decisions. You make good decisions from a place of peace. And so always go after peace before you make a major decision. And if you have not entrusted everything to the Lord, there can be a lot of other things that are driving your decision making. A lot of times what people experience, they're like, oh, I made the decision not to do that. I have so much peace. I'm like, no, you have a sense of relief. Jesus was able to make decisions that led to his own crucifixion from a place of peace after he went and spent time in prayer with the Father, anguished in prayer. And then what do you see him through the rest of the crucifixion process? Just an incredible peace, completely unfazed by all the abuse and suffering in his life because he had entrusted that whole process to the Father with it. Make sense? All right, thanks for a great study. You guys were great. We're going to finish up the book next week. Same thing for this coming week with your extra credit. Implication questions, but really focus in on you can't ask an implication until you've answered factual. Okay, so you got to ask your factual questions, get your answers, and then you can ask an implication question. Okay? All right, God bless you guys. Have a great rest of your week.